Hello everyone, it's SAFF, probably better known as SAFFRONOLIVE, and it's time for another edition of Brewer's Minute. So this week, we are talking about one of the most requested and most interesting, I think, topics that we cover on Brewer's Minute, and that is modern sideboarding. But today, we're going to take a slightly different approach. Rather than talking big picture meta stuff like, oh, you need Graveyard Hate, or here's the most played sideboard cards in the format, we're going to look at actual real sideboards from some popular modern decks and basically break them down into two, or like, I guess sort of three camps. But the basic premise of this is sideboarding in unfair decks versus sideboarding in fair decks. And the difference is in building a sideboard between those two kind of meta archetypes in Modern. So if you're somehow not familiar with unfair slash fair as far as terms, unfair decks are the decks that are looking to kill you really quickly and kind of goldfish to the wind, not really paying too much attention to what you're doing for the most part, trying to do their combo or execute their game plan and kill you before what you're doing really matters. On the other hand, fair decks are the decks that are kind of looking to play some creatures, maybe some planeswalkers, some removal spells, and win a fair game of Magic. So there's a really massive difference when it comes to sideboarding and building sideboards in those two archetypes, and that is our main topic for today. So a quick reminder before we break down modern sideboarding, fair versus unfair. If you enjoy Brewer's Minute and the other series here on the channel, it would be amazing of you if you could take a second, click that subscribe button down at the bottom of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So how this is going to work is actually super simple. We have a bunch of decks, I think 6 or 7 decks all together, some of them unfair, some of them fair, and we're basically just going to look at their sideboards. We're not really paying attention to the main deck, just the sideboard cards. So let's kick things off with the unfair decks. And unfair decks, as we talked about in the intro, are not really interested in what the opponent's doing. They're trying to execute their game plan, and the sideboards of unfair decks are built with that in mind. Unfair decks know that once they go to sideboarding, the opponent is going to bring in more things to try to disrupt their combo, especially if they're playing a fair deck. So the unfair decks are trying to anticipate what the opponent's going to do in sideboarding and bring in cards that are able to allow them to still execute their game plan through the additional hate cards and interactive cards the opponent's going to bring in. So, for example, IRONWORKS combo. It's pretty simple. You know how IRONWORKS works? It is trying to combo off on turn 3 or turn 4 with this huge sort of Storm-esque turn with tons of mana from Cleric Clan IRONWORKS. If you look at the sideboard, it breaks down really simply. Yes, it has Lightning Bolt as a removal spell, which you could argue doesn't really do anything directly for the combo, but the entirety of the IRONWORKS sideboard outside of Lightning Bolt is stuff to facilitate their combo plan. Nature's Claim comes in to deal with things like Stony Silence, things like Rest in Peace, things like Leyline of the Void. Graveyard Hate and Stony Silence are two of the biggest enemies of the IRONWORKS combo deck, so Nature's Claim is a way to fix that problem. Negate is also along the same lines. Instead of dealing with the Stony Silence or the Leyline of the Void on the battlefield, it's doing it while it's on the stack. And then Sidemaster Thopterus might not be as obvious as some of the other cards as a way to support the combo, but what this is doing is giving IRONWORKS combo a way to win through Graveyard Hate and through Stony Silence. The other island is just to support Sai and make sure you have the mana to cast it, but that is also a way to facilitate your game plan. Like, if your opponent's going to bring in Stony Silence, Rest in Peace, Leyline of the Void, which tons of decks have in the sideboard, Sai is a way you can win even through that. So if you look at the IRONWORKS sideboard as a whole, 11 of the 15 cards in the sideboard are solely dedicated to forcing its combo through its opponent's sideboard hate. And you can even argue that Lightning Bolt is a way to like beat a Thalia, which is another popular sideboard card that is really hard for IRONWORKS to beat, or a Kataki War's Wage, something like that. So the sideboard is almost exclusively dedicated to making the combo work through its opponent's sideboard cards. Storm is kind of similar. If you look at the Storm sideboard, it is very similar to the IRONWORKS sideboard. This is how unfair deck sideboard. If you go card by card through this, Pieces of the Puzzle comes in as a way to allow you to still have enough resources to combo off through opposing counter spells. Echoing Truth, Wipe Away are ways that you can get rid of a Rest in Peace, for example, or a Thalia. The same is true of Lightning Bolt and a Braid. Then we have ways that allow you to win even through the opponent's hate cards. Pyromancer's Ascension allows you to storm off without using your graveyard because you just double all your spells and can win naturally. Empty the Warrens is a way you can combo off and win without using your graveyard. So Ascension and Empty the Warrens are essentially the size of the Storm sideboard. They might not obviously look like answers to the opponent's answers, but they really are. They're ways that you beat your opponent's sideboard hate. So again, almost exactly like the Ironworks sideboard. The sideboard is solely dedicated to allowing you to execute your game plan through your opponent's cards. I guess you can argue about Lightning Bolt and a Braid, but still they take down Thalias. So most of the sideboard, or arguably all of the sideboard, is designed to let you force your game plan, your combo, through your opponent's stuff. You're not playing the, I'm going to bring in some Wrath, I'm going to bring in Sweltering Suns and try to play this fair game. That's not how Unfair Deck sideboard. You are looking to execute your game plan, and your sideboard is almost exclusively focused on that. The same is true for the most part of Dredge, another unfair deck in the format. Yes, you get a little bit of removal, Lightning Axe, Dark Blast, but really, Nature's Claim, Ancient Grudge, Duress, Golgari Charm, that is most of the sideboard exclusively dedicated to cards that can deal with things like Rest in Peace, Ensnaring Bridge is another card that is really big, but the Dredge sideboard has a full 8 or 9 cards, depending on how you count it, that are dedicated to dealing with graveyard hate. Most of the sideboard is dedicated to saying, this is my game plan, I'm going to execute it, I know you are going to bring in things to make it harder for me to execute my game plan, but I'm going to bring in things so I can still execute my game plan through your sideboard hate cards. So that is unfair sideboarding. If you are building a sideboard for an unfair deck, don't dirtle around with sweepers and removal spells for the most part. You want most or even all of your sideboard to allow you to execute your game plan, even through your opponent's sideboard hate cards. On the other hand, let's say you're playing a fair deck. Fair decks are basically the opposite. So fair decks are the decks that are playing some creatures, maybe casting some Path to Exiles, winning eventually by playing a fair game of Magic. And if you look at a deck like BANT Spirits, its sideboard is almost a direct opposite of the unfair deck sideboard, where nearly all of the sideboard slots are dedicated to allowing you to have a chance to beat the unfair decks, because that's where fair decks struggle. Fair decks are good at playing a real game of Magic and kind of going back and forth with mid-range decks or fighting through control decks, but if your opponent's going to Ironworks you or storm you off on turn 3, that's where the fair decks run into trouble. So if you look at the BANT Spirit sideboard, it has Dapping Sphere and Thalias as answers to decks like Storm, to decks like KCI. You get Rest in Peace to deal with Dredge and Graveyard decks, Stony Silence to deal with decks like Tron, Ceremonious Rejection to deal with decks like Tron. So that is most of the sideboard being dedicated to dealing with the unfair decks. And then you can argue that Geist of St. Traft is sort of a sigh of BANT Spirits. If your opponent's playing an unfair deck and not really playing creatures, and instead they're trying to like assemble these pieces and combo off, Geist of St. Traft comes in and kills your opponent really quickly. So even though it's not as obvious as Damping Sphere, it is still kind of a card designed to let the BANT Spirits deck deal with the unfair decks. And another example of this is MARDU Pyromancer. MARDU Pyromancer, one of the fairest decks in the entire Modern format, and its sideboard really reflects this by being heavily weighted to deal with unfair decks. Alpine Moon, to deal with Tron and Valakut. Molten Rain, same way, 5 cards dedicated to those unfair matchups. If you're running into Storm or KCI, you have things like Kemble Council of Elocution, which is a great way to slow down those decks. Leyline of the Voids to deal with Dredge and Storm, the unfair decks. Collective Brutality is an additional discard spell. So yes, you do sneak in a couple fair things. Zealous Persecution lets you deal with your opponent's Lingering Souls. Liliana lets you grind for value. But nearly all of the sideboard cards are dedicated not to protecting your own deck. You're not saying, okay, I gotta make sure that my Lingering Souls is gonna resolve, that I can resolve my Bedlam Reveler. You're not doing that. Instead, you're saying, I'm gonna make it harder for you to do your thing, because if I can make the game be fair and make you play a real strategy unfair deck, then my deck is going to win because I'm playing the fair deck. So that is the big difference. The fair decks are sideboarding in cards to stop the unfair decks, essentially, while the unfair decks don't really care about what the fair decks are doing. They're bringing in cards to try to force their combo through, and that is kind of the weird paradigm of modern sideboarding. I did want to mention one kind of quick third category, and that is fair decks that are already sort of pre-sideboarded for the unfair decks. So the best example of this is GRIXIS Death Shadow. GRIXIS Death Shadow, while you might say it's not fair because it's casting massive Death Shadows really early in the game, it is at its heart a fair deck. You're playing creatures, you're playing removal spells, you're playing some discard, but as you can see, unlike the other fair decks we're talking about that are just overloaded with like 10 cards to fight unfair matchups, GRIXIS Death Shadow, it's got more stuff for fair matchups. It's got Anger of the Gods to deal with aggro decks. It's got some more removal, Liliana of the Veil to grind out value, Grim Lavamancer to deal with small creatures, Kolaghan's Command is even more removal. So instead of being like a typical fair deck where you're overloaded on Damping Spheres and Rest in Pieces and Leylines of the Void and all this stuff to slow down the unfair decks, GRIXIS Death Shadow is a fair deck that is sideboarded to be even better at beating other fair decks, which makes it kind of unique and sort of rare. And the reason for this is GRIXIS Death Shadow already is set up to beat the unfair decks in its main deck. If you look at the main deck of GRIXIS Death Shadow, you got Thoughtseizes, you got Inquisitions of Kozilek, you got Collective Brutalities, you got Stubborn Denials. Your entire main deck is already set up to say, alright Storm, or KCI, I have a million answers for you. So if you're already pre-sideboarded to beat the unfair decks with your fair deck, then you can have a little bit more flexibility in what you have in your sideboard. Anyway, that's been our topic for today. So the TLDR is pretty simple. If you are building a sideboard for an unfair deck, a combo deck in Modern that's looking to kill quickly, don't fall into the trap of playing fair cards in your sideboard. Weight your sideboard heavily or even exclusively towards making sure you can execute your primary game plan, making sure you can still combo off after your opponent brings in their sideboard hate cards. On the other hand, if you're building a fair deck in Modern, then you want your sideboard dedicated almost exclusively to stopping the unfair decks, with Graveyard Hate, with ways to deal with Storm, with ways to deal with Tron, all those unfair strategies that kill you really quickly, because if you're the fair deck, you will win the long game if you can make the game go long. So try to bring in stuff to make your opponent play a fair game of Magic and fight you on your terms, because you're not going to outstorm Storm if you're playing Bant Spirits, or if you're playing Humans, or another fair deck like that. That's not how it works. But if you can make your opponent play a fair game plan when they want to be playing an unfair game plan, then the fact that you're playing just objectively more powerful cards than your opponent is going to shine through and win you the game. And then thirdly, if you're the fair deck with lots of Thoughtseizes or even Stubborn Denials like GRIXIS Death Shadow, then you can play a little bit of a mix. Still keep the unfair decks in mind, but if you already got it covered with your main deck, then you can go a little bit lighter with the sideboard. So anyway, hopefully this was helpful. Keep this in mind next time you sit down to build your Modern deck. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.